be part of the Jewish people and to be connected to Israel, and that Israel can be a light to the nations in this kind of way. Yes. Is really beautiful. Yeah. Okay. So let's begin. We're going to talk about a very timely topic because Yom HaAtzmaut, Israeli Independence Day, was last week, so it's timely in that sense. What I wanted to do is take a look at one of the most controversial teachings of Rav Kook, who is considered to be the theoretician of religious Zionism, though I don't think that he himself would like to apply that term to himself. Interestingly enough, Rav Kook was never a member of any Zionist organization. The only organization that Rav Kook ever belonged to was Agudat Yisrael, which is the ultra-Orthodox Agudas Yisrael, it should be pronounced, right? Which is a group which represented ultra-Orthodox Jewry. And that was the only organization that he ever joined. He was never a member of Mizrahi, which is the religious Zionist organization. He was not associated with Bnei Akiva or anything like that, which existed later in his lifetime. So, but that gets into things that we can't discuss today. I want to focus on one particular aspect of his understanding of Zionism, but we're first going to have to back up a little bit and talk about, in just very brief terms, who was Rav Kook. So Rav Kook was born in 1865 in Latvia. Now, in 1865, Latvia makes you a Litvak. Okay, so even though Latvia and Lithuania are not exactly the same thing nowadays, but in those days, that's what Lithuania, well, it was Greater Lithuania, which included Latvia. My paternal grandparents happened to be also from Latvia. And he had a very traditional Torah education, came from a family of great scholars. And I've mentioned this many times to people that have studied with me over the years, that he came from a weird mixture. And that is because on the one hand, his father had been part of the elite of Lithuanian Talmudic scholarship, had studied in the great yeshiva in a town called Volozhin, which was a yeshiva founded by the chief disciple of the Vilna Gaon. That's where his father studied. And Rav Kook himself studied in that great yeshiva of Volozhin. And you may know that the Vilna Gaon was the arch enemy of the Hasidic movement. And there were tremendous conflicts between the Litvaks, Lithuanian Talmudic Jewry, and this new movement, this Hasidic movement. Strangely enough, and I don't know the backstory of this, Rav Kook's mother came from a Chabad Hasidic family. I don't know how that happened, but he was this combination of, on the one hand, of great Talmudic genius coming from presumably his father's side, and great soulfulness coming from his mother's side, the Hasidic aspect. And he has embodied within him the synthesis of great Talmudic tradition coming from the Vilna Gaon, that side of his father, and this great soulful spirituality in the Hasidic style coming from his mother's side, and gracefully incorporated into himself. Now, Rav Kook in 1904, after serving as the rabbi of several different communities, as their rabbi in Lithuania, he received an invitation to move to the land of Israel, 1904, and he comes to Yaffo. What was Yaffo at the time? Yaffo was the urban center of what we call the new Yishuv, the new settlement. The Jewish population of Eretz Israel is often divided up into, when we're talking about this period, into two communities, mostly at war with each other. The old Yishuv, HaYishuv HaYashan, which was composed of the disciples of the Vilna Gaon, disciples of the Baal Shem Tov, who had come to the land of Israel already in the late 18th century and early 19th century. They came for pietistic reasons. They didn't come to build kibbutzim. They came in order to worship God in the special spiritual environment of the Holy Land. And of course, there were also Jews who were there, Sephardic Jews particularly, who had been there especially from the 16th century, living in Eretz Israel. And then there's the new Yeshuv. The new Yeshuv were composed of the Zionist settlers who came towards the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. So that's the old Yeshuv and the new Yeshuv. And the new Yeshuv were mostly people who had non-religious ideologies, who had ideologies really more based upon Karl Marx and the Torah of Moshe, okay? And they were the ones who built the agricultural settlements, moshavim and kibbutzim, etc. Yaffo was the urban center of the new Yeshuv. Now, of course, in 1904, there was no Tel Aviv. Nowadays, Tel Aviv is actually called Tel Aviv Yaffo. It's a combination of those two places. Yaffo was incorporated into Tel Aviv, but at this time there was no Tel Aviv. So there were traditional Jews who identified with the Zionist movement. And Rav Kook came to Yaffo and it served as their rabbi. He also tried to influence the agricultural settlements that were being built up the Mediterranean coast and up into the Galilee. And Rav Kook stayed in Yaffo for 10 years. In 1914, he goes to Europe in order to attend a convention of the only organization he ever belonged to, Agudas Yisrael. And this was very bad timing because World War I broke out soon after he landed in Europe, and he was trapped in Europe for the entire period of World War I. He spent part of that time in Switzerland as the personal house guest of a wealthy Jew in Switzerland. He was involved exclusively in thinking and writing during this period. It was a very fruitful time intellectually for Rav Kook. And then for the second period of World War I, he moved to London. He became the rabbi of a shul, Machzikei Adat, in London. He was there, of course, when the United Kingdom issued the Balfour Declaration. Rav Kook had a role in the getting that proclamation issued. Now, Rav Kook, then after things settled down, the war was over. Now things are very different in Eretz Israel. Eretz Israel is no longer part of the Ottoman Empire. It's now part of the British Empire. It's under British mandate. And Rav Kook is invited to return to Eretz Israel, but not this time as the Rav of Yaffo, which is part of the new Yeshuv. It's sort of out of the lens of the old Yeshuv. The old Yeshuv is primarily in Yerushalayim and in Svat and in Tiberia and in Hebron. As long as Rav Kook stayed in Yaffo, he could be the creative thinker that he was without stirring up too much trouble. But now he's invited to come to Yerushalayim to be the Rav of Yerushalayim under the British mandate. The only problem is there were already very distinguished Rabbanim of the old Yeshuv in Yerushalayim. Primarily two rabbis, Rabbis Diskin and Rabbi Sonnenfeld, were the two primary rabbinic leaders of the old Yeshuv in Yerushalayim. And all of a sudden, under British auspices, this person, Rabbi Kook, who is a Haredi Jew in his education, in his appearance, in his practice, his piety, his scholarship, but he has interesting and fresh ideas, and he's moved into Yerushalayim as if he's the chief rabbi, and the old Yeshuv is not too thrilled about this. They have their whole world with their own rabbis. After a short period of time, this is 1919, 1921, the office of chief rabbi of all of Eretz Israel is created, and Rabbi Kook becomes the first chief rabbi of Eretz Israel, Ashkenazi chief rabbi, under the British mandate. So that's 1919. Now, all heck broke loose in 1920, the next year. It didn't take long. When Rav Kook published a not very big book, it's a book called Orot. As a matter of fact.
What is it called?
I couldn't get it. Orot.
Here we go.
Like.
He published this book.
Okay.
Can you see this book?
Yep.
Okay, so it's not a particularly big book, but this book was a compilation of writings that Rav Kook had written during World War I when he was trapped in Europe. And this book stirred up a hornet's nest of controversy. It was so controversial that Rav Kook was excommunicated by prominent rabbis of the old Yeshuv. Part of the ceremony of excommunication is the blowing of the shofar. A book was published called Kol Shofar, the voice of the shofar, which was a kind of symbolic way of expressing excommunication of Rav Kook. And this book, Kol Shofar, in detail condemned Rav Kook's book, Orot, right? And forbade the reading of Orot.
Did you say that was the cookbook?
It's a Rav Kook book. Is that what you said, Dwight?
Cookbook.
Yes. Right. So the, hang on one second here. Let me just turn my volume up so I can hear Dwight better. There we go. Now, this book was signed by Rabbis Diskin and Sonnenfeld, who were the two most prominent rabbinic authorities of the old Yeshuv. And I'd like to read for you one short passage from Kol Shofar, the book which was written to condemn Rav Kook. And it says the following. There was brought before us a recently published booklet by a local rabbi. By the way, Rav Kook was the chief rabbi of Eretz Israel, but he's just a local rabbi, according to this book, Kol Shofar. And then the writer goes on to say, we were astonished to see gross things foreign to the entire Torah of Israel. Deathly poison is in it. And here it is. Now, after that critical review, that's a sure key to being a bestseller. Who would not want to read a book that has gross things foreign to the entire Torah of Israel and that has deathly poison? Wouldn't you go out and buy a book like that? So this book actually did become quite popular. Now, at this time, the Ger Rebbe, that particular Hasidic movement of Gur was the largest Hasidic movement by far in Europe. And the Ger Rebbe was one of the most prominent rabbinic leaders in all of Europe. He came to Israel at this time for the purpose of scouting out the suitability of encouraging mass migration of his Hasidim to Eretz Israel. But while he was there, he was asked to intercede between Rav Kook on the one hand and Rav Sonnenfeld and Rav Diskin on the other, or more exactly, the followers of Rav Kook and the followers of Rav Sonnenfeld and Rav Diskin. This is, by the way, often true in these rabbinic fights, that it's not so much the people at the top of the food chain that are fighting with each other, but one step below who have these. As a matter of fact, Rav Sonnenfeld and Rav Diskin and Rav Kook were actually personal friends on a not on an ideological level, on a personal level, and they would attend each other's happy occasions, etc. The Ger Rebbe was asked to intercede, and he talks to parties on both sides of the conflict, and he writes a report after talking to all parties. he praises the knowledge and piety and intentions of Rav Kook, but he criticizes, and I quote, the strange things in his books. He also criticizes the disrespectful and controversy-mongering ways of some of Rav Kook's opponents. And then he says he's brokered an agreement that Rav Kook would express regret for passages that were offensive, while his opponents agreed that they would express regret for maligning Rav Kook. Of course, as many of these agreements are, they weren't worth the paper that they're written on, and it didn't work out this way. Peace was not achieved between these warring camps. And as a matter of fact, the British had to arrest some rabbis who were so violent and aggressive in their opposition to Rav Kook that under British law, you're not allowed to disparage a public official. And since he was the chief rabbi of Eretz Israel, that was grounds for arresting these rabbinic opponents of Rav Kook, not Rav Sonnenfeld, Rav Diskin, but lower ranking rabbis. Now, what was there about this book, Orot, which was so incredibly offensive? So I'd like to read another short passage from Kol Shofar, the book that was written in order to condemn Rav Kook. It says the following: even those young men and women who engage in athletics and frivolity, known to us to be Sabbath desecrators and immoral, he claims to be serving Avodat HaKodesh, holy service of God. The Ger Rebbe also apparently was particularly upset by this particular passage, which we'll see in a few moments. And the Ger Rebbe writes, to glorify the athletics of sinners and to flatter them in such a shocking manner, to extend peace to them as if they were Malachei Hasharet, ministering angels. This outrages the pious beyond description. So apparently Rav Kook had said something positive about athletics or sport or exercise that particularly triggered a very angry response from many in the old Yeshuv. We're going to take a look now at the passage that apparently was so explosive and offensive and even heretical in the eyes of these rabbinic leaders from the old Yeshuv. So now I'm going to do, I hope some of you printed or downloaded the text, but I'm going to, in any case, do a screen share here. And let's pull it up. Anybody see anything?
Not yet. Not yet. There it goes. Got it.
Got it. Yep.
Okay. Now, I've been debating whether to read this in Hebrew and translate or just look at the English. And I think what I'm going to do is just read it in English. I think that would, if you have the Hebrew, you can follow along. Rav Kook writes, great is the bodily demand made upon us. We require a healthy body. Now, so far, I'm not sure why this is so controversial. You know, the Rambam, for instance, writes that we have to take care of our health. This is obviously a very timely issue here in terms of the coronavirus, that taking care of our health is a great priority in Jewish values. The Rambam writes that one cannot possibly serve God properly if one is not feeling well.
Mm-hmm.
Hard to study Torah when you're distracted by physical pain. So far, this doesn't sound that controversial. But in the third sentence already, Rav Kook starts to ruffle feathers. We have dealt much with spirituality, but we have forgotten the holiness of the body. We have abandoned health and bodily strength. We have forgotten that we have holy flesh, no less than we have a Holy Spirit. We have left practical life, the clarification of the senses, and the bond with bodily, sensory existence due to a fallen fear, due to a lack of faith in the holiness of the land. Now let's just back up and try to tease out, to, as it were, flesh out what Rav Kook is saying here. Now you notice at beginning in the third sentence here, we have dealt much with spirituality, but we have forgotten the holiness of the body. Rav Kook is now critiquing the state of the Jewish people in his time and how they are living their Judaism. And he's not talking about the Chalutzim, the Zionist pioneers, obviously. He's talking about Orthodox Jews, traditional Jews. And he's saying that contemporary Orthodoxy, the way it is observed, has forgotten the holiness of the body. It has dealt much with spirituality, but has forgotten the holiness of the body. Let's talk about that for a second. Rav Kook felt that just as an individual has a body and a soul, so too a nation has a body and a soul. The soul of the Jewish people is the Torah. The body of the Jewish people is the way it manifests itself as a nation living as a normal nation in its land. That is, primarily, the body of the nation is the land itself. But it also means all the institutions of state that go along with having a corporate entity, a nation. That is a political system, a judicial system, an economic system, a police force, an army, etc. All of those things are expressions of the collective body of the nation. And Rav Kook is claiming that the Jewish people is living a distorted existence, that we have dealt much with spirituality, but have forgotten the holiness of the body. What happened, according to Rav Kook? As long as you have a land, you have a body. As long as you have a state, you have the context in which to express the corporeal aspect of the Jewish people, the bodily aspect of the Jewish people. But once the Jewish people were deprived of their land, deprived of the possibility of being a political entity in its own land, to be a state, the only thing left is the Jewish spirit and no body. So the Jewish people became solely involved with the spiritual, the soulful aspect of what it means to be a Jew. And we forgot that we lack something profound. We lack a body. And what's even more disturbing is that at a certain point in history, we forgot that there's even such a notion of the holiness of the body. Imagine someone who suffers from a physical disability. They can't see. Imagine that as a result of not being able to see, they cultivate other aspects of their personality, a heightened sense of hearing, a heightened tactile sense, etc., to compensate. Imagine if that person then regards that as a superior state of being and even loses sight of the fact that having vision is an incredibly important part of being a whole person. The Jewish people, unfortunately, forgot that there's even such a notion of the bodily expression of the Jewish people, and felt that being purely spiritual is in fact the way we're supposed to be in essence. I'll give you an example. When Yitzchak is faced with Yaakov, who's pretending to be Esav, in order to get the blessings that were intended for Esav. So Yitzchak can't see, and Yaakov has furry arms as a result of putting on a costume so that he would feel like Esav. And Yitzchak says, I'm confused. Hakol kol Yaakov. The voice is the voice of Yaakov. V'yadayim yedei Esav, but the arms are the arms of Esav.
Mm-hmm.
That verse, which in context is addressing that particular narrative, was understood traditionally by many, many rabbis as an expression of what is the essential difference between Yaakov and Esav on a collective level. Yaakov is Israel, Jews. Esav is Rome, the non-Jewish world. We are the voice. Hakol kol Yaakov. The voice is the voice of Yaakov. That's who we are. What does voice mean? The spirit, prayer, Torah. What about the non-Jewish world? Esav, hands.
Physical.
They're people of hands. We are the voice, they're the hands.
Sure.
We don't have hands. Jews don't have hands. We don't need hands. That's not what our contribution is to the world. We are a nation of voice, a disembodied spiritual existence. And Rav Kook condemns that and says it's a distortion. It's a distortion which is a result of exile, where we started to view the state of disembodiment of the Jewish people in exile as if it's the ideal. We have forgotten that we have holy flesh, no less than a Holy Spirit. We have left practical life. The clarification of the senses, what he means by that is that part of having a body is bodily expression, especially through art. That's what art is. Whether it's sculpting, whether it's painting, whether it's music, that all has to do with bodily, sensory existence. And the truth must be told that the Jewish people did not excel in artistic expression during exile. Nowadays, some of the greatest musicians, painters, etc., are Jews. But that wasn't true for the preponderant time of existence in exile. Really, only when Jews came out of exile did they enter into when they came into the wider world through the Enlightenment, the Jews enter into the world of arts again. And this is all due to a fallen fear. Jews strive for yirat shamayim, fear of God, awe of God. But Rav Kook uses a term, fallen fear. It's a distorted fear of God. It's a fear of God that says that I am so concerned about transgression that I'm going to sequester myself from embracing the material outside world, lest I succumb to temptation. I'm going to sequester myself purely to the realm of the spiritual, not to the realm of the hands. That is a yirat shamayim, a fear of God, which is distorted, a fallen fear, due to a lack of faith in the holiness of the land. Rav Kook means this as a double entendre. That there is, on the one hand, he means land, the land of Israel, and the inability to understand the profound significance of the land of Israel. Even the land is holy. The dirt of the land of Israel is not just dirt, it's holy dirt. But he means land also in a metaphorical sense of landedness, of bodiliness. And then he goes on. All of our teshuvah will succeed. And when he says teshuvah, he means that also as a double entendre. Teshuvah means repentance. It means spiritual growth. But it also literally means return. And that's a reference to return to the land of Israel. All of our return will only succeed. That is spiritual return, spiritual renaissance, and also geographic renaissance. The return to our land, it'll only succeed if together with the splendor of its spirituality. Obviously, teshuvah requires a spiritual renaissance, but it has to be more than that. There must be as well a physical teshuvah, a physical renaissance, that the Jews return to bodiliness, a physical teshuvah which fashions healthy blood, healthy flesh, solid, strong bodies, a fiery spirit shining forth upon strong muscles. Wow. That's an incredible sentence. I cannot imagine another Orthodox rabbi calling for a teshuvah which will fashion healthy, strong bodies, a fiery spirit. Am I muted?
You're breaking up.
Ooh. How about
Be
now?
on.
Am I okay?
Yeah.
Everything's good?
I just was asked to mute everyone because of some odd noises coming through, but it should be okay.
Okay, so everything is good?
Yeah.
Okay. Right, okay. And then Rav Kook says, within the sanctified body will radiate the weakened soul, evocation, a soul, evocative of bodily resurrection. That is, that when the Jewish people experience teshuvah, which is holistic, not just a spiritual renaissance, but a physical renaissance, that we return to the realm of bodiliness on a personal level and on a collective level. And this is what Zionism is about. It's a return to bodiliness. He says that that's going to, in fact, reinvigorate our soul as well. Within the sanctified body will radiate the weakened soul. Rav Kook says it's so wrong to think that you can excel in spirituality without excelling in bodiliness. The two are connected. As the Rambam states, on a personal level, we cannot study Torah at optimum efficiency if we don't feel well, if we're distracted by physical pain and weakness. Only when we have full physical vigor can we have full spiritual vigor. So a return to bodiliness will, contrary to what people may think, will spur on and activate a spiritual renaissance as well, evocative of bodily resurrection. It'll be a kind of tchiyat hametim, a resurrection of the dead, that the body will be resurrected and a resurrected soul will inhabit that body. And that is the meaning of the Zionist movement. Rav Kook is not done. Now he says the following. I want to show you a picture first. I don't know if you'll be able to see it very well. We're going to sort of skip here to the end. Can you see this picture?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
So that is a group of Zionist pioneers in Beit HaKerem, which is now a neighborhood of Jerusalem, in 1925. And they're all lined up and doing gymnastics together. Okay? So that was very offensive to the old Yeshuv, seeing all of these young Jews who were involved in muscularity. Okay? So now Rav Kook says the following. The exercise done by the youth of Israel in the land of Israel, right? That photograph I just showed you, which was something which was profoundly offensive to the leadership of the old Yeshuv, in order to strengthen their bodies to become strong sons for the nation. You know that exercise? It perfects the spiritual power of the supernal righteous. I'll explain this in a minute, who engage in the unification of the holy names in order to accentuate the divine light in the world. That is a heavy sentence. It's Kabbalistic. I want to explain. Rav Kook says the following. It's not just that each individual, to the extent that they are more healthy and strong, that they will then possess a revitalized spirit, but it also is true with regards to the different components of the Jewish people. That one can regard the Jewish people collectively as a corporate entity where some members of the Jewish community have a more natural inclination, relatively speaking, towards soulfulness, and some members of the Jewish nation have a natural proclivity towards physicality. And they are not in conflict. They are mutually beneficial. That to the extent that these young Zionist pioneers strengthen themselves, that is going to perfect the spiritual power of the righteous who are in the Beit Midrash, learning Torah and engaging in unification of the holy names by the holy work that they're doing in the Beit Midrash. They're creating the unification of holy names. We don't have to discuss what that means right now, but it's good. In order to accentuate the divine light in the world. The revelation of one light cannot exist without the other, meaning the light of bodiness and the light of spirituality must exist together, and each one complements the other. And now he quotes psukim from the book of Shmuel, where the writer says, V'yas David Shemot, that David made a name. And look at that Kabbalistically, David, a great man of the spirit who unifies the name of God. That's not the simple meaning of that verse. That's being understood here Kabbalistically. And David performed justice and righteousness for his entire nation. David represents the spiritual perfection of the Jewish people. The very next phrase after, and David performed justice and righteousness for the entire nation, is, and Yoav ben Tzruya was over the army. And the Talmud says, the reason that David was able to perform spiritual efforts for the Jewish people to perform justice and righteousness was only because Yoav was over the army. We needed a great military leader to enable David to accomplish his spiritual accomplishments. And the only reason that Yoav was able to accomplish what he did on the battlefield was because of the righteousness of David. The two must go together. And now, the final paragraph. This holy service, meaning exercise, being involved in cultivating bodily strength and bodiliness, and Rav Kook got it on the head for this sentence, elevates the Shekhinah, the divine presence, ever upwards, as its elevation through, it should say here, the songs and praises uttered by King David in the book of Psalms. Rav Kook says that working out elevates the Shekhinah, as does Tehillim, the recitation of the holy words in the book of Psalms. The old Yeshuv went ballistic over this. How could one compare those irreligious Zionist pioneers out there in the field of Beit HaKerem, exercising in their hundreds together, improperly dressed, boys and girls together, etc., that somehow has a spiritual impact upon the divine presence, elevated upwards, like the book of Psalms. But Rav Kook qualifies that. And he says the elevation brought about by the supernal intentions, however, affects the inner soul. That is, those who are in the Beit Midrash, learning Torah, that elevates and affects the more internal aspect of the soul, while the actions that strengthen the body of individuals for the sake of the collective brings about the elevation of the external spirit. So one is more internal, one is more external, but both are necessary. Both of them together perfect the network of holiness in its entirety through the accentuation of the character of the nation, through that brief passage upon which the entire body of the Torah depends, and all your ways know him. Now, what's that about? Rav Kook ends his little essay here by quoting a passage in the Talmud. That passage reads, Bar Kapar expounded, which is a brief scriptural passage upon which all the principles of the Torah depend. And he quotes from Proverbs, this is the essence of Judaism, this is the essence of Torah. In all thy ways acknowledge him, and he will direct thy paths. Let's pause there. Rav Kook quotes that. And he says, what does that mean, in all thy ways know him? It means not just through spirituality, but also through physicality. That all of existence must be sanctified. All of existence must be embraced in acknowledging God and in serving God. Not just in the Beit Midrash, but outside of the Beit Midrash as well. Not just in things that are overtly spiritual, but also in those things which are sensory and bodily. In all thy ways acknowledge him. And with this, Rav Kook ends his essay. But I want to show you something which is quite shocking, which Rav Kook doesn't say, but I'm pretty confident he had in mind. This passage in the Talmud goes on. Rav Kook doesn't quote this part. The passage says, Rava said, even for a matter of transgression, that you should know God even in transgression. Now, I want you to bear in mind that Rav Kook is talking about Zionist pioneers who are not observing Torah in many major areas of Torah observance. And Rav Kook actually addresses that in a passage that I don't have quoted here. I just want to read to you. Just listen to this. He says, do not be astonished if there are shortcomings in the way of life of those engaged in physical and bodily strengthening in Israel. I know, Rav Kook says, that you probably think it's strange that I could praise them even though they have shortcomings in the way of life, right? The way they live their lives. And then Rav Kook explains cryptically, for even the manifestation of Ruach HaKodesh, divine inspiration, requires clarification from the admixtures of impurity that seep in. I'll read that again. For even the manifestation of divine inspiration, Ruach HaKodesh, requires clarification from the admixtures of impurity that seep in. Rav Kook is saying the following. Ever since Adam ate from the Eitz Hadat Tov Hara, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. The nature of our world is an admixture of good and evil. Nothing is purely tov, good, or purely ra, evil. The nature of existence is complex. Even Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, has admixtures of evil within it, of impurity. And the historical process, according to the Kabbalah, is the gradual sifting out of the impurity from the purity. The process of tikkun, of repair. So Rav Kook is saying that when I talk about the great benefit that these Zionist pioneers are bringing to the Jewish people, that they are at the vanguard of returning us to the body, to bodiliness, and they don't keep Shabbat, that shouldn't surprise you. Because everything is complex. Everything is a mixture, and everybody is a mixture. Even those who, the pious, engaged in exclusively a life of spirituality, are they not also involved in reprehensive acts of impurity, of evil? Is anybody pure? We're all complex and mixed. And we have to be able to identify the good and acknowledge it. Not to ignore the bad and acknowledge that as well. But one doesn't detract from the other. Now keep that paragraph in mind. Rav Kook concluded here by saying, the Talmud says, in all your ways know him, right? That even through physicality. Now the Talmud added, Rava said, even for a matter of transgression. Even know God through transgression. Now, wait a second, what does that mean? So Rashi says, it's not as shocking as you may think. Rashi says, see if it is for the sake of a mitzvah, like Eliyahu on Mount Carmel, and if so, transgress. Let me explain briefly. You may be familiar with the famous story of Eliyahu challenging the prophets of Baal, saying to them, let's have a contest to prove who's the real God. You put an offering on your altar, I'll put an offering on my altar. And whoever's offering is accepted by God spontaneously, a fire coming out of heaven and causing their offering to combust, that's a proof that that's the real God. The prophets of Baal were not able to have a fire come down from heaven and cause their offering to combust, but Eliyahu was successful. And the people who witnessed this proclaimed, Hashem hu Elokim, the Lord is God, which we recite at the end of the Ne'ilah service on Yom Kippur. So Rashi says that's a matter of transgression that Rav is referring to. Why? Because according to the Torah, you're not allowed to build a sacrificial altar outside of Jerusalem. How was Eliyahu, Elijah the prophet, allowed to build a sacrificial altar in Mount Carmel? Not allowed. But he did it because it was an emergency. He had to prove that God is the real God. So in a certain technical sense, it's a transgression, but it was for the sake of heaven. So that's how Rashi understood this passage, that in all your ways know him, Rava said, even for a matter of transgression, that sometimes you can do a transgression, which is also part of serving God, like Eliyahu, the prophet Elijah on Mount Carmel. However, it's not so simple, because there's an alternative manuscript of the Talmud that is very explicitly not like Rashi's explanation. That manuscript of the Talmud, which is preserved in the collection of Agadot of the Talmud called Ein Yaakov, quotes the beginning of the Talmud the same way. Bar Kapara expounded which is a brief scriptural passage upon which all the principles of the Torah depend. In all thy ways acknowledge him, and he will direct thy paths. Rabbah said, even for matter of transgression. Fine. But then there's another sentence. Rav Papa said, this is the meaning of the popular saying, Ganva apum macharta rahmana kare. A thief at the threshold calls out to the merciful one. That's an example of serving God through transgression. Not the prophet Elijah at Mount Carmel, but a thief, a real transgressor, a board-certified transgressor who's not doing it for the sake of heaven. He's a thief, a professional thief. But you know what? Before he breaks in, he says, God, look, this is what I do for a living. Can you please help me out here? I want to be successful. So this passage in the Talmud, which is found in the alternative manuscript, is an absolutely amazing sentence, which is saying, in all thy ways know him, that even things which are so complex, like this thief who is a transgressor explicitly and unambiguously, but there's also a spiritual component to it. And he prays to God that he be successful. He's a mixed bag and has spiritual, religious significance. And I believe that Rav Kook was alluding to that when he describes the holy contribution of these Zionist pioneers who are at the vanguard of returning the Jewish people to bodiness, even with all their complexity and even with all their transgressions. In all thy ways know him. Even transgression is part of a larger picture of a complex forward movement in tikkun, in repair of the Jewish people, and the renaissance of the Jewish people, the rebirth of the Jewish people in its land, their return to bodiness. Now, in the last few minutes, I want to put this in historical context, which will help explain, if you haven't understood already, why this was so shocking to the sensibilities of the old Yeshuv. Max Nordau. Who is Max Nordau? Max Nordau was a physician. He was born in Hungary, 1903. I'm sorry, he published this in 1903, born in 1849. But he became a professional journalist. He moved to Germany, and then he lived most of his life in Paris. Died in 1923. Max Nordau said this about himself. When I reached the age of 15, I left the Jewish way of life and the study of the Torah. Judaism remained a mere memory, and since then I've always felt as a German, and as a German only. Max Nordau married a Christian woman. He became a very well-known writer and journalist. As a result of the Dreyfus affair, along with his friend Theodor Herzl, who was also a journalist covering the Dreyfus affair in Paris, they, both of them together, founded the Zionist movement. Max Nordau was the partner with Theodor Herzl in the founding of the Zionist movement. Nordau came to the conclusion that being a German, that's the way he identified himself, no longer as a Jew, was not going to be the answer to insecurity that the Jewish people faced. Only the return to the land of Israel or to some kind of place. He actually supported the idea of having a Jewish state in Africa, which was floated at a certain point. Only by renewing Jewish nationhood could we attain security for the Jewish people. Max Nordau was the main organizer of the Zionist congresses. And in 1898, he said the following: we must think of creating once again a Jewry of muscles in the narrow Jewish street our poor limbs soon forgot their gay movements. In the dimness of sunless houses, our eyes began to blink shyly. The fear of constant persecution turned our powerful voices into frightened whispers, which rose in a crescendo only when our martyrs on the stakes cried out their dying prayers in the face of their executioners. But now, all coercion has become a memory of the past, and at last we are allowed space enough for our bodies to live again. Let us take up our oldest traditions. Let us once more become deep-chested, sturdy, sharp-eyed men. And he coined the phrase, Muskeljudentum, Jewry of muscle, muscular Jewry. Can you see a commonality between Max Nordau and Rav Kook? Can you imagine how the old Yeshuv, not just the old Yeshuv, but any Orthodox Jew must have thought about Max Nordau, who, without shame, talked about how by the time he was 15, Judaism was a mere memory. He married a non-Jewish woman, a Christian woman, and then came up with this idea eventually, because the Dreyfus affair, of we should become a nation again, but not with any kind of spiritual definition of what that might mean. And talks about the Jewish people as being this weak, fearful shadow of a human being, and calling for a return to bodiliness, right? Space enough for our bodies to live again, to become deep-chested, sturdy, sharp-eyed men. You remember Rav Kook's expression when he talked about, when he said, healthy blood, healthy flesh, solid, strong bodies, a fiery spirit shining forth upon strong muscles. The condemnation of Rav Kook's orot wasn't insane. The condemnation of Rav Kook was not written by people who didn't understand what he was saying. They understood what he was saying on a certain level. That Rav Kook seems to be echoing ideas that are coming from sources who have a radically irreligious notion of what it means to be a Jew. But I hope by looking at Rav Kook's writings, as we did today in greater detail, we can see that the commonality is in a certain sense superficial. That Rav Kook is looking at what is happening to the Jewish people. He sees the return to the land of Israel. He sees the growth of this longing of the Jewish people to actualize, not just to pray for the return to the land of Israel, but to actualize that and to return to bodiliness, to the working of the land, etc. But Rav Kook sees that within a spiritual framework. He understands that as Tchiyat HaMeitim, resurrection of the dead. He understands that as being an essential process of the unfolding of redemption of the Jewish people, of restoration of a healthy spirit within a renewed collective body. Whereas Max Nordau understood it, as I think you can see, the way he understood it. Got to be strong, got to be proud, got to be able to beat up our enemies, etc. So the similarity is striking, but the difference is profound. And this is a remarkable example of how Rav Kook could embrace the Zionist movement, not because he identifies with its ideology, in the same way that its ideologues understood it, but because he saw forces of redemption, spiritual forces working their way through a complex but coherent manner, leading to the ultimate redemption of the Jewish people. With this, we'll end today's discussion. And if you have any questions or comments, I would be delighted to hear from you. You can send me an email and I will definitely answer them. So have a beautiful week, and we all look forward to a complete return to health, godliness, not only for the Jewish people, for us personally, but for the entire world as we move forward out of this present crisis.
Amen, amen.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeshayahu, תודה רבה.